How do you catch a killer when every name you find belongs to a different person? This question haunted the investigators from the moment they stepped into a case tangled in shadows deeper than any they had encountered before. It was a Yakuza-linked murder, a crime that almost seemed straightforward at first glance. Clear motives, unmistakable brutality, but the trail quickly dissolved into a labyrinth of identities that defied reason. Every lead they chased spiraled into confusion. Names changed like smoke in the wind, addresses shifted like mirages, and histories appeared only to vanish before they could be verified. The initial shock wasn't the murder itself, but the unsettling realization that the suspect was not a single, stable individual. Instead, the killer existed as a collection of fragments, each one seeming legitimate on its own yet impossible to pin down as one person. Police records, surveillance footage, witness statements, all pointed to different people, each with their own backstory, yet all somehow connected to the same crime scene. Instead of narrowing the search, each new identity expanded the mystery, pulling the investigation into an ever-widening circle of uncertainty. In a world where identity is often the first clue, this case inverted everything. Instead of uncovering who the killer was, the investigators found themselves trying to understand who the killer was not. There was no single face to match the crime, no consistent biography, no traceable past that fit neatly into a profile. Every document contradicted another. Every lead forked into multiple possibilities. The killer's existence was like a shattered mirror, broken into countless shards that reflected different versions of a person who never truly existed as one. This was not a man who fled to escape justice. He did not hide behind walls or disappear into the night. Instead, he vanished by becoming many. Each identity was a carefully crafted mask, worn just long enough to serve its purpose before being discarded like an empty shell. The killer's weapon was not a gun or a knife, but the very concept of identity itself, splintered, multiplied, and dissolved into nothingness. In this way, he did not run from the law. He outran it by never being the same man twice. The investigators faced a chilling truth. This was not a case of a missing person or a fugitive on the run. It was a case of a man who had erased himself not by absence, but by endless reinvention. In the tangled web of names and faces, the killer was a ghost who refused to be caught, slipping through the cracks of reality by living as many people at once, and none at all. The search for a single suspect became a hunt for a shadow, elusive and fragmented, hiding in plain sight behind a mask of countless identities. As the layers of this case unravel, it becomes clear that such disappearances are not mere coincidences but the product of deliberate, painstaking concealment. In tracing the movements of a man who exists simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, the investigation demands attention to the faintest details and the quietest anomalies. This is a narrative not often told, one that ventures beyond typical crime stories into the obscure territories where organized crime, identity manipulation, and vanishing acts intersect. With every fragment uncovered, the picture grows more complex, revealing a network of deception and survival strategies that challenge the very notion of a fixed self. As the investigation presses forward, the focus remains on the subtle interplay between presence and absence, identity and erasure, ensuring that the story maintains its rigor and clarity. This is a space where details matter, where the quiet revelations accumulate to expose the extraordinary within the ordinary, guiding the audience deeper into a world where criminals become ghosts by design. Within the Yakuza's operational framework, identity is deliberately fluid, treated less as a fixed personal attribute and more as a strategic asset to be molded, exchanged, or discarded as circumstances demand. This flexibility is central to how members navigate both their internal hierarchies and the external pressures of law enforcement scrutiny. Their use of aliases, borrowed names, and front businesses creates a labyrinthine social and operational landscape where the boundaries of individuality blur, making it increasingly difficult to pin down any one person's true identity. Aliases are not mere nicknames but function as carefully selected masks adapted to specific roles or contexts. A single individual might answer to multiple names depending on the setting, one identity for dealings within the clan, another for public-facing enterprises, and yet another when interacting with outsiders such as suppliers or corrupt officials. These names often carry symbolic weight or coded meaning within the Yakuza's internal culture, but are deliberately mundane or generic enough externally to avoid drawing attention. This multiplicity of names allows a member to compartmentalize their activities, effectively segmenting their life into isolated spheres that appear unrelated to anyone outside the immediate circle. The practice of borrowing names further complicates identification. Names and reputations can be temporarily lent or appropriated by associates, creating a web of interchangeable identities. For instance, an individual might operate under the name of a higher-ranking member during certain transactions, or a name linked to a legitimate business might be used by multiple people in rotation. This diffusion of identity is not haphazard but carefully managed through clan protocols and trust networks, ensuring that while names circulate, the true person behind them remains obscured. Such a system leverages collective responsibility and loyalty to maintain secrecy, while simultaneously disrupting any straightforward paper trail or eyewitness account that could be used in an investigation. Front businesses serve as physical manifestations of this identity fluidity. These enterprises, ranging from small restaurants to import-export firms, exist primarily as legal facades, often registered under names that do not correspond to the actual operators. Key personnel within these businesses might change regularly or operate behind layers of corporate structures, making it difficult to ascertain who is truly in control. The public face of a front company is deliberately constructed to be nondescript and interchangeable. This ensures that outsiders, including law enforcement agents, see a stable, legitimate entity rather than a shifting network of concealed actors. As a result, linking an individual's real identity to a front business requires navigating a maze of forged documents, proxy registrations, and compartmentalized roles. Compartmentalization extends beyond names and businesses into the social fabric of the Yakuza environment. Members are encouraged to maintain strict boundaries between different areas of their lives and operations. Information is shared on a need-to-know basis, with many individuals unaware of the full scope of activities or the true identities of their counterparts. This isolation reduces the risk that a single defection or breach could unravel the entire network. It also means that even if law enforcement identifies one alias or front, that discovery rarely provides a reliable path to uncover the wider organizational structure or the real individuals behind the masks. Because of this architecture of disposability and segmentation, investigations grounded in conventional notions of identity are frequently undermined. When a suspect's name leads to a front business, that business's ownership appears legitimate and unconnected. When a witness provides an alias, that name may belong to someone else entirely or be in active circulation among multiple actors. This constant shifting of identity not only obscures personal histories, but also erodes the reliability of any evidence tied to names or documented affiliations. In such an environment, identity ceases to be a stable anchor for investigation and instead becomes a tool deliberately fashioned to evade detection, ensuring that the Yakuza can function as a shadowy network where individuals exist socially and operationally under different guises without arousing immediate suspicion. From the moment the scene was secured, investigators braced themselves for the kind of clarity that rarely accompanies cases woven into the fabric of the Yakuza's elusive world. Typically, a murder investigation begins with a thread, an individual, a known adversary, a name whispered in the right circles that, when pulled, unravels a broader narrative. Here, those threads were conspicuously absent. Instead, the crime seemed to exist in a vacuum, refusing to anchor itself to any single figure, any recognizable history, or any concrete motive. The victim's identity, though established, offered no immediate leads. Unlike conventional cases where the deceased's connections point toward possible suspects or motives, this victim's associations were shrouded in layers of ambiguity. Interviews with acquaintances yielded inconsistent stories, each version slightly diverging from the last. It was as though the victim's social and professional circles were deliberately fragmented, obscured by a pattern of shifting alliances and concealed affiliations. The usual markers, rivalries, debts, vendettas were notably absent or at best, entangled in a web too intricate to discern. Investigators anticipated discovering a name linked to the crime, a person whose presence at the scene or connection to the victim would provide a foothold. Instead, the evidence resisted this expectation. Surveillance footage offered fleeting glimpses of figures whose features were obscured or altered, and digital footprints led to dead ends or aliases that dissolved into the digital ether. The crime scene itself held no clear signs of struggle or confrontation that might suggest a known assailant. Instead, it bore the hallmarks of a carefully staged event, one designed to confound and misdirect. The confusion began almost immediately. Witnesses recalled vague impressions: a shadow passing by, a voice indistinct in the noise of the city, a presence felt rather than seen. There were no clear confrontations, no heated exchanges recorded in the moments leading up to discovery. The usual grounds for suspicion, disputes, threats, jealousies, were conspicuously muted. This silence was deafening, unsettling investigators who relied on such cues to build profiles and motives. Efforts to trace the victim's movements prior to the incident were similarly thwarted by the fluidity of identity endemic to the environment. Contacts who should have had reliable information proved unreliable themselves, their stories shifting with each retelling. The victim's own history seemed to fracture under scrutiny, revealing contradictory affiliations and a trail that led to multiple, incompatible identities. It was as if the individual was a composite of several personas, each occupying different social or operational spheres, none of which intersected in a way that illuminated the crime. This absence of a clear suspect or singular narrative began to unsettle the investigative team. Without a name to focus on, no history to contextualize the act, the case defied traditional methods of inquiry. The crime's very nature seemed to reject simplification or straightforward explanation. Instead, it mirrored the broader landscape in which it occurred, a realm where identities are mutable, where alliances are ephemeral, and where truth is cloaked beneath layers of deliberate obscurity. As the hours stretched into days, the investigation became a study in ambiguity. Every lead that appeared promising dissolved into contradiction. Every potential suspect vanished into the shadows before they could be named. The murder, rather than anchoring itself to an individual or a story, drifted instead as a specter within the community. A reminder that in this world, some crimes are designed not to be solved, but to remain suspended in uncertainty, eluding capture as effectively as those who dwell within the shadows themselves. The first name that surfaced in connection with the case was, on the surface, as ordinary as any. It belonged to someone who seemed to exist comfortably within the everyday rhythms of life, an identity that had been crafted with meticulous care. The documents bore all the hallmarks of legitimacy: a driver's license issued just months prior, a utility bill with a recent date, even a lease agreement tied to a modest apartment in a nondescript building on the city's outskirts. This was no hastily thrown-together alias. It was a constructed reality, one built to withstand the casual scrutiny of a clerk or a landlord. Neighbors recalled seeing the individual come and go, blending seamlessly into the fabric of the block. Mail was delivered regularly, bills were paid on time, and the occasional visitor was spotted entering the building, though none seemed familiar enough to be interviewed. The routine was unremarkable but consistent: morning coffee from a nearby cafe, an evening walk along the park's winding paths, a part-time job at a local hardware store confirmed by a manager who remembered a quiet but dependable employee. This identity operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, designed to be just real enough to function without raising suspicion. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, small fissures began to appear under closer examination. The lease, while bearing signatures and official stamps, came from a landlord who, when pressed, seemed evasive about the tenant's background. The utility bills, though in the name of the suspect, were tied to accounts that had been opened and closed in unusually short cycles, never lingering long enough to establish a deeper financial trail. Employment records were sparse, limited to brief stints that ended abruptly, with no clear reason or follow-up. Even the ID itself, while genuine in appearance, showed signs of irregularity. The issuing agency's records held no prior history for the name, and the photograph did not match any known database beyond what had been provided. The face, unfamiliar and untraceable, was a mask rather than a reflection. Attempts to cross-reference this identity with acquaintances, family ties, or any social media presence yielded nothing. No digital footprint, no personal history. It was as if the name existed in a vacuum, a ghost tethered to a series of documents rather than a life. This first identity had been real enough to slip through the cracks of everyday life, to interact with the world in a way that suggested presence and normalcy. It was a functioning fiction, a carefully maintained shadow that moved through the city without leaving a lasting mark. But it was also inherently fragile. The more investigators dug, the more the foundation crumbled beneath them, revealing it as a construct designed not to last, but to buy time, a placeholder in a game of deception. The name faded quietly from the investigation, slipping back into the shadows from which it had emerged. It was neither a red herring nor a full truth, but something in between, a whisper of identity that spoke volumes through its silence, hinting at a deeper labyrinth yet to be uncovered. In the end, it was a reminder that in the shadows of this crime, even what seems real can dissolve with a single, searching glance. The discovery of a second identity sent a ripple through the investigation, disrupting the fragile clarity the team had begun to piece together. On paper, this new persona appeared as a stark contrast to the first: different names, distinct birth dates, separate social circles. Official documents bore the unmistakable marks of legitimacy. A passport under one name, a driver's license under another. At first glance, they seemed to belong to two entirely separate lives, parallel tracks that never intersected. Yet, beneath the surface, subtle threads began to unravel the illusion. Investigators found themselves grappling with discrepancies that refused to align. Timelines that should have been mutually exclusive instead intertwined with unnerving precision. Meetings purportedly attended by one identity overlapped suspiciously with events tied to the other. Phone records revealed calls made at impossible intervals, as if one person could be in two places at once. Behavioral patterns, too, hinted at a shared origin. The same nuanced mannerisms, the identical way of speaking in coded phrases, even the recurring habit of leaving messages that seemed like deliberate breadcrumbs. The realization dawned slowly, almost imperceptibly. This was not a case of one identity masking another or a simple alias used to evade detection. Instead, the individual was rotating between personas, each stepping forward and retreating in a carefully choreographed sequence. Unlike concealment that hides, this rotation revealed a strategy of controlled exposure. It was as if the person behind these identities was performing a complex dance, swapping masks to manipulate perception without ever fully disappearing. Structural clues within the documentation further deepened the intrigue. Both identities shared subtle overlaps in their histories, schools attended within the same districts, employment records that suggested overlapping job roles, and addresses that converged on the same neighborhoods but were registered under different names. These intersections were too consistent to be coincidental. Rather than two separate existences, these were fragmented reflections of a singular life, fractured and dispersed across multiple fronts. The behavioral overlaps confirmed what the data suggested. Witnesses described interactions with both identities using remarkably similar language and tone. The same measured calmness punctuated conversations, and an identical pattern of evasiveness emerged when pressed for details. Even moments of vulnerability, glimpsed through fleeting expressions or hesitant replies, echoed across encounters with both personas. It was a psychological signature that transcended the superficial distinctions on official records. The investigators' growing awareness shifted the narrative from one of concealment to one of rotation. This was not about hiding a truth, but about controlling which version of truth emerged at any given moment. The identities were not parallel lines but alternating shadows cast by the same figure, each activated to serve a purpose, to mislead or to reveal just enough. The investigation's challenge evolved into tracking the rhythm of this rotation. When one identity stepped forward, the other receded, and vice versa. This complex interplay of identity complicated efforts to pin down motives or predict future actions. Understanding the rotation became key to anticipating moves and deciphering intentions. The individual's ability to inhabit these distinct yet overlapping identities revealed a calculated mastery over self-presentation, a deliberate fragmentation designed not to escape scrutiny, but to manipulate it. In this revelation, the shadows grew deeper, not lighter, as the investigation confronted a truth that was not hidden but dynamically, chillingly visible in its movement. The killer's use of multiple identities functioned as a sophisticated mechanism to diffuse suspicion and obscure a coherent profile. Each persona carried its own set of characteristics, behaviors, and interactions that, taken individually, seemed plausible and unrelated to the crimes. This fragmentation meant that no single identity bore the full accumulation of incriminating traits or patterns, effectively diluting the risk across a spectrum of separate selves. Investigators found themselves chasing disparate leads, none of which converged into a unified image capable of pointing decisively to one individual. By rotating through these identities, the perpetrator distributed the elements of their operations, contacts, locations, and activities, so that each persona only absorbed a fraction of the overall risk. For example, one identity might engage in preliminary surveillance or information gathering, while another carried out direct actions linked to the offenses. This compartmentalization ensured that if any single identity drew attention or aroused suspicion, it could be abandoned or altered before enough evidence accumulated to establish a reliable connection. The killer's strategy resembled a relay race, passing the baton of culpability from one guise to the next before any could be definitively pinned down. The transient lifespan of each identity was crucial to maintaining this delicate balance. None remained active long enough to be fully exposed or thoroughly profiled. This temporal limitation prevented the consolidation of behavioral patterns that could have revealed psychological or logistical consistencies. Instead, investigators were left with fragmented snapshots, partial data points that could not be easily synthesized. The killer's deliberate avoidance of prolonged presence under any single alias thwarted attempts to link activities over time, effectively resetting the trail with each transition. Furthermore, the shifting identities created a labyrinthine social network, where associates and witnesses encountered varying versions of the same individual, each tailored to specific contexts and objectives. This multiplicity sowed confusion and mistrust among those who might have otherwise provided useful insights. Testimonies conflicted, timelines blurred, and the boundaries between fact and fabrication grew increasingly indistinct. The killer's fluid self-presentation capitalized on these uncertainties, transforming the investigation into an exercise in navigating shadows rather than illuminating a clear path. In essence, the killer's mastery over identity was not merely a tool for evasion but a form of psychological warfare against the investigative process. By ensuring that no single identity accrued enough exposure, the perpetrator maintained control over the narrative and the flow of information. This control extended beyond simple disguise. It was an active manipulation of perception, where the fragmentation itself became a protective shield. The investigation, confronted with this multifaceted deception, had to contend not only with hidden actions, but with the very structure of the killer's existence, making every step toward clarity a challenge against a shape-shifting adversary. This complex interplay of identities underscored a deeper strategic intent, to remain perpetually elusive not through invisibility, but through relentless reinvention. The killer's pattern was a dynamic puzzle, each piece isolated and mobile, resisting the formation of a stable picture. The investigation's efforts to anticipate movements or decipher intentions thus required adapting to a reality where the subject's identity was as fluid as the shadows they inhabited, a calculated fragmentation that protected the killer by preventing the emergence of a singular, traceable profile. Over time, every trace of the killer's known identities began to fade, not through a sudden flight or a cinematic escape, but through a gradual, almost imperceptible disappearance. The aliases once tethered to bank accounts, phone numbers, and digital footprints ceased to respond. Calls made to those numbers went unanswered. Addresses linked to these personas turned up empty, often marked by eviction notices or abandoned properties. The accounts, meticulously maintained for months or even years, quietly lapsed into inactivity, as if the owner simply chose to vanish without a trace. This was not the act of a desperate fugitive running from the law. There was no frantic crossing of borders or hurried boarding of planes. The killer did not flee in the traditional sense. Instead, the identities themselves expired, one after another, each quietly withdrawn like a shadow retreating at dawn. It was a disappearance executed with patience and precision, leveraging the very fragmentation that had long protected them. Rather than risking exposure by attempting to maintain these personas indefinitely, the killer allowed them to dissolve naturally into obscurity. Investigators watched as the carefully constructed mosaic of false identities began to crumble, not with a bang but with a whisper. The killer's digital life, once a vibrant labyrinth of activity, dimmed steadily. Social media profiles went dormant, email accounts stopped sending messages, and financial transactions ceased. The killer's world, once intricately connected yet deliberately fractured, slipped beneath the radar, blending into the countless other faceless presences scattered across the digital landscape. The absence of any dramatic event deepened the mystery. Without a conventional escape route or a traceable flight path, the killer's vanishing act defied expectations. It was a disappearance not marked by urgency, but by an almost clinical detachment, a deliberate erasure from the public and investigative consciousness. The calculated fragmentation of identities had served its purpose, to prevent a singular, unbreakable thread from leading back to the person behind the mask. As the investigation drew on, it became clear that the killer had mastered the art of disappearing without running. The strategy wasn't about outrunning pursuers or hiding in physical shadows, but about dissolving the very concept of a stable identity. Each persona was a temporary vessel, abandoned once it had served its function, leaving no permanent anchor for authorities to seize. This fluidity rendered traditional methods of tracking and profiling ineffective, forcing investigators to rethink how to pursue someone who existed primarily through absence. In the end, the killer vanished not by crossing borders or disappearing into a crowd, but by allowing every known identity to quietly expire. No dramatic confrontation, no frantic escape, only the slow, deliberate fading into nothingness. It was a vanishing act befitting the shadowy figure who had long resisted definition or capture. For those intrigued by the complex interplay of identity and evasion, stories like this reveal the lengths to which some will go to erase themselves completely. If you find the art of disappearing behind layers of false identities as compelling as we do, consider following Shadow Crimes for more deep dives into the minds and methods of criminals who slip through the cracks by becoming no one at all. Investigators faced a daunting challenge in their attempt to consolidate the tangled web of names and faces into a singular, coherent identity. Each lead seemed to multiply the confusion rather than clarify it. Official records presented conflicting versions of the same individual, with discrepancies in birth dates, places of origin, and physical descriptions. Fingerprints matched no single database conclusively, while surveillance footage captured different appearances that seemed to shift with each sighting. The system, by design, demands a definitive person, a fixed existence defined by documents, biometric data, and verified histories. Yet, this case continually defied those parameters. Efforts to cross-reference social security numbers against immigration files, employment records, and medical histories yielded only partial matches, often linked to different aliases. In some instances, an identity would appear briefly in one jurisdiction, only to vanish abruptly, replaced by another that bore a striking resemblance but different details. Investigators traced these threads through multiple states and even international borders, uncovering dead ends in bureaucracies where records were incomplete, lost, or deliberately altered. The deeper the search went, the more it became apparent that the subject was not merely hiding but actively erasing traces of any consistent self. Legal frameworks, while essential for protecting rights and ensuring due process, imposed additional constraints. Without a verifiable identity, many investigative tools became limited in their application. Surveillance and interviews required probable cause connected to a named individual. Warrants hinged on documented ties. Forensic comparisons depended on existing profiles. The absence of an anchored persona meant that suspects could not be officially named, charged, or even tracked with the usual legal rigor. The system's insistence on identifying a person was a structural necessity, yet in this case it became a barrier. Interviews with acquaintances, informants, and former associates only deepened the mystery. Names overlapped, stories conflicted, and memories blurred, as if those who might have known the individual had themselves been drawn into a fog of uncertainty. Some recounted encounters with a man whose appearance and demeanor fluctuated. Others described a shadowy figure who seemed to vanish as easily as he appeared. These testimonies, while valuable, were insufficient to anchor the investigation in a concrete identity. Technological avenues, such as facial recognition and biometric analysis, offered tantalizing glimpses but no definitive proof. Attempts to build a profile using composite sketches and behavioral patterns produced a fragmented image, part myth, part reality. The subject's deliberate manipulation of identity markers amplified this fragmentation, exploiting the very systems designed to track and classify. Ultimately, the investigation revealed the limits of institutional frameworks when confronted with someone who exists as a phantom within them. The need for a fixed identity, a name, a legal status, a traceable history, is fundamental to how justice and order function. Without it, the machinery falters, caught in an endless loop of uncertainty. This case did not simply lack a suspect. It lacked a person in the eyes of the system, a ghost constructed from contradictions, slipping through the cracks by never truly being one. Detective Harris sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the worn file spread across his desk. The case had been a labyrinth from the start, but today, a small detail flickered like a faint beacon through the shadows. It was nothing more than a barely legible annotation in the margin of a witness statement. A misspelled name, almost a slip of the pen, but it caught his attention immediately. The name was close to the alias they'd been chasing for weeks, but with a subtle difference. A missing letter, a swapped vowel. At first glance, it looked like a simple error, but something about the timing and context made Harris pause. The witness had described a man seen near the scene days before the latest incident, a figure matching the vague description that had been the closest thing to an identity they'd managed to sketch. The inconsistency was that the location of this sighting didn't quite align with the suspect's supposed movements, yet the handwriting suggested urgency, almost a correction, as if the person recording the testimony had second-guessed themselves. Harris leaned forward, tracing the smudged ink with a finger, trying to piece together whether this was a genuine mistake or a cryptic clue left unintentionally. He pulled up the surveillance footage from the vicinity, cross-referencing the times recorded in the statement. The grainy images showed a figure moving briskly, head lowered, indistinct in the twilight haze. The timestamp was off by a few minutes from the witness's account, but not enough to rule it out. It was tantalizingly close. If this figure was the man they'd been searching for, the misspelled name might have been the key to breaking through the fog. Yet, the deeper Harris dug, the more the trail frayed. Attempts to match the altered name against known records yielded nothing. No corresponding social security number, no prior arrests, no driver's license. The system's cold indifference swallowed the anomaly whole. It was as if the man existed only in those fleeting seconds captured on camera and in the hesitant scribbles at the bottom of a witness statement. The inconsistency hovered like a ghost in the files, unresolved and mocking. Still, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this near miss was something more than coincidence. It pulled at the edges of his mind, the way unresolved puzzles do, beckoning, teasing. He assembled a timeline, overlaying the witness reports with every other piece of data they had. Phone records, street cameras, even cryptic mentions in intercepted communications. Patterns emerged, but none fit perfectly. Each lead drew them nearer, only to dissolve into ambiguity. The tension in the room thickened as the hours passed. Harris's partner glanced over, sensing the shift. "You think it's him?" she asked quietly. "Almost," he replied, rubbing his temples. "But not quite. If only that name was right, or if the timestamp matched perfectly. We're one step away from closing this, but the pieces still don't line up." The frustration was palpable. The investigation was perched on the brink of revelation, balanced precariously on the edge of a detail too faint to grasp. It was a moment where certainty almost took shape, only to be snatched away by the silence of missing records and the blank spaces where a person's life should have been documented. Harris stared again at the file, the misspelled name now etched into his memory. It was the closest they had come to anchoring the shadow to a reality, a fragile thread connecting the ghost to the world. But with no definitive proof, no concrete identity, the case remained suspended, an echo of what might have been, forever caught in the space between knowing and doubt. The truth behind this Yakuza-linked murder slips further into the shadows not because the killer vanished in a singular, dramatic moment, but because the killer was never meant to exist as one person at all. What law enforcement chased was not a solitary figure but a shifting constellation of identities. An elusive mosaic of operatives, each fragment hiding behind layers of deception, each playing a part in a carefully orchestrated collective. The anonymity achieved here was not an act of erasure but multiplication, a diffusion of culpability that defies conventional pursuit. This was a crime woven into a network, where culpability is dispersed and responsibility diluted. Every name scratched out, every false lead followed, every fragmented clue was a deliberate move within a grander design to confound, misdirect, and ultimately protect the true architects. The killer's face is not one to be found in a single photograph or fingerprint. Instead, it is a ghost assembled from countless shadows, each indistinguishable from the next, making the idea of a killer a paradox, an entity that exists only in the aggregation of its parts, never as a whole. As investigators tried to pin down a suspect, they were chasing phantoms. Identities layered, swapped, and interchanged like masks in a dark theater. This fragmentation is the perfect camouflage. It creates a labyrinth without a center, a puzzle that dissolves when you try to grasp it. The absence of a unified identity is not a failure of investigation but the very strategy that ensures the crime remains unresolved. It is a silent pact between the shadows and those who dwell within them, a pact that turns the killer into a myth, a specter that haunts the edges of truth and justice. What remains is an unsettling question. How do you fight a foe who does not simply hide but multiplies? How do you bring to light a crime when the criminal is not a single figure but a dispersed force, constantly shifting and reforming? This case leaves a chilling imprint, reminding us that some killers don't disappear. They fragment, scattering their presence like smoke in the wind. If this enigma compels you, if the idea of a criminal who vanishes by shattering their identity into countless parts unsettles your understanding of justice, then you must look deeper. The next Shadow Crimes episode delves into those who escape not by fleeing, but by becoming many, fractured selves that slip through the cracks of law and memory. Watch closely, for in those fragmented reflections may lie the key to confronting the unseen.